frozen bear begs man to enter the house. He is shocked by what happens next. On a freezing winter night, deep in the heart of the forest, a lone man hears an eerie sound at his door. When he opens it, he doesn't find a stray dog or a passing traveler. He finds a bear. Not just any bear, but one battered by the storm, frost clinging to its fur and desperation in its eyes. What would you do if a creature of the wild turned to you for help? Would you slam the door or take the risk and let it in? This story isn't just about survival. It's about trust, connection, and the unexpected way life sometimes gives us exactly what we need, even when it comes wrapped in fur and claws. The wind howled through the dense spruce and fir trees of the valley, bending their frosted branches into unnatural shapes. Snowflakes like frozen whispers spiraled against the log walls of Elliot Ron's cabin. Inside, the dim glow of a cast-iron wood stove cast long, flickering shadows across the room. Elliot sat slumped in an old leather chair, a tattered Nikon D850 camera resting on the table beside him. It had been his lifeline to the outside world since he'd retreated here nearly 2 years ago, capturing the untamed beauty of this isolated patch of Montana near Glacier National Park. The walls of the cabin were adorned with photos of elk, grazing in morning mist, a bald eagle soaring over Lake McDonald, and a snow-covered ridge glinting in the weak winter sun. Despite the comfort of the images, the cabin was eerily silent tonight, the kind of silence that pressed on his chest, reminding him of all that he'd lost. The sharp crack of ice shifting outside made him sit upright. He glanced toward the frosted window. Shadows played tricks in the dim light, the towering trees shifting with the wind. Then he heard it, an unmistakable sound, a low, guttural whimper, almost like a dog's but deeper. Elliot's pulse quickened. There shouldn't be anyone or anything this close to the cabin. The nearest road was 5 miles away, and most creatures avoided human warmth during the cold months. He moved cautiously to the window, his breath fogging the glass as he peered into the snowy expanse. At first, all he could see was white, the endless white of winter draped over the earth like a burial shroud. And then it moved, a large figure, dark against the snow, hunched low near the porch. It was a bear, but not the robust, majestic kind he had seen in summer, lumbering confidently through the forest. This bear was gaunt, its fur clumped with ice. Steam rose faintly from its nostrils as it panted heavily, its front paw pressed awkwardly into the snow. "No, Jesus," Elliot muttered under his breath. His mind raced. This was a grizzly, Ursus arctos horribilis, a species both revered and feared in these parts. Normally, such a creature would steer clear of humans, especially during hibernation season. But this bear looked desperate. Desperation could mean danger. He grabbed his flashlight from the kitchen counter, clicked it on, and opened the door just a crack. A gust of icy wind rushed in, biting his face. The bear barely flinched at the light, only shifted slightly to meet his gaze. Its eyes, amber pools of exhaustion, stared back with an intensity he couldn't ignore. "Are you hurt?" Elliot whispered, as if expecting an answer. The bear let out a low rumble, more a groan than a growl. It lifted its injured paw and limped a step closer, its massive frame sagging under its own weight. Instinct told him to slam the door, to lock himself away from this powerful predator. But something about the bear's movements, its labored breathing, stopped him. This wasn't aggression. It was a plea. All right, he muttered, more to himself than to the bear. Grabbing a thick wool blanket, he stepped cautiously onto the porch, his boots crunching in the snow. He stopped just short of the bear, who stood shivering in place. Up close, the animal's condition was even worse. Its coat was patchy, its ribs prominent beneath the fur. Frost clung to its whiskers like tiny icicles. "Let me see," Elliot said, his voice low and steady. The bear shifted its weight, lowering its head as though resigned. It was then he noticed the deep gash on its paw, the skin raw and blackened around the edges, frostbite creeping in. "You poor thing," his voice cracked as he wrapped the blanket around the bear's shoulders. It didn't resist, only flinched slightly as the warmth touched its icy fur. With one cautious step at a time, Elliot guided the bear inside the cabin. The heat from the wood stove hit the bear immediately. It collapsed onto the wooden floor with a heavy thud, its breathing labored but steady. Elliot stood frozen, gripping the edge of the table for support. A bear, a grizzly, was lying in his cabin, mere feet away. And yet, as surreal as it was, he felt no fear. Only an overwhelming wave of pity. He retrieved a first aid kit from a cabinet, along with a jar of honey, real Montana clover honey he'd bought from a roadside stand months ago. He set the jar near the bear, unsure if it could eat in its condition. To his surprise, the bear's nose twitched, and with great effort it licked at the honey, its tongue curling around the jar's rim. "That's it," Elliot murmured. "You'll be all right. We'll figure this out." As he sat down on the floor beside the bear, exhaustion hit him, like a tidal wave. But for the first time in years, it wasn't the heavy, suffocating kind that had plagued him since the accident. It was the kind that came with purpose, the kind that made him feel, if only for a moment, alive again. Outside, the wind howled on, but inside there was only the soft crackle of the fire and the sound of the bear's labored breathing. For the first time in a long while, Elliot didn't feel entirely alone. The morning broke slowly, a pale gray light creeping into the cabin through frost-rimmed windows. Outside, the storm had left a fresh blanket of snow, smooth and untouched, except for the jagged trail of paw prints leading to the porch. Inside, the warmth of the wood stove painted the walls with a faint golden glow, but it wasn't enough to shake the chill from Elliot's bones. He had spent the night in the leather chair, dozing lightly with one ear tuned to the sounds of his unexpected guest. The bear lay sprawled on the cabin floor, its sides rising and falling in uneven breaths. The blanket Elliot had draped over it was damp now, melted snow seeping into the coarse fibers. The creature stirred. Its amber eyes flickered open, glassy with fatigue, but more alert than they had been the night before. Elliot approached slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. "Hey there," he said softly, crouching a safe distance away. "Looks like you made it through the night." The bear blinked, its gaze following him as he reached for the first aid kit on the counter. Elliot's hands trembled slightly as he rummaged through the contents. Antiseptic wipes, bandages, a small tube of antibiotic ointment. These were tools meant for human wounds, but they would have to suffice. "I'm going to help you," he murmured, more to calm himself than the bear. "Just don't bite me, okay?" The bear's injured paw rested awkwardly on the floor, the raw gash stark against the pale fur. Elliot knelt and placed the first aid kit beside him, taking a moment to steady his breathing. The air between them felt thick, charged with a fragile trust that could shatter with one wrong move. He reached out cautiously, his fingers brushing against the paw. The bear flinched, a low growl rumbling in its chest, but it didn't pull away. "Easy," Elliot said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know it hurts, just hold still." He began cleaning the wound, the antiseptic wipe drawing a hiss of pain from the bear. Elliot winced in sympathy, his own heart aching as he worked. The gash was deep, deeper than he'd realized, and frostbite had set in along the edges, turning the tissue black and brittle. He applied the ointment carefully, wrapping the paw in layers of gauze until it resembled a makeshift boot. "There," he said, sitting back on his heels. "Not perfect, but it'll do for now." The bear lifted its head slightly, its eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made Elliot's chest tighten. It wasn't gratitude, at least not in the way humans expressed it, but there was something there. A flicker of understanding that left him momentarily breathless. Elliot rose and moved to the kitchen, where he rummaged through the cabinets for something the bear could eat. He found a can of salmon, the label faded but still legible, and opened it with a manual can opener. The sharp metallic click echoed in the quiet cabin, drawing the bear's attention. He set the can on the floor a few feet away and stepped back, giving the animal space. The bear sniffed the air, nose twitching before dragging itself toward the food. It ate slowly, its movements heavy with exhaustion but deliberate. As the bear ate, Elliot leaned against the counter. Arms crossed over his chest, he watched in silence, his mind a whirl of questions. Why had the bear come to him? How had it known he would help? And what had driven it to such desperation in the first place? The storm had passed, but the forest beyond the cabin remained shrouded in an eerie quiet, the kind of stillness that pressed on his nerves, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Elliot's gaze drifted to the window, where the snow-covered landscape stretched out in pristine isolation. He had chosen this life for its solitude, seeking refuge from the chaos of the world, and the chaos in his own mind. But now, with this unexpected visitor lying wounded on his floor, he felt a strange sense of connection. It was as though the bear's presence had shifted something within him, stirring emotions he had long buried. After finishing the salmon, the bear rested its head on the floor, its breathing slowing into a steady rhythm. Elliot approached cautiously, retrieving the empty can and placing it in the sink. He couldn't help but smile faintly at the sight. The massive creature sprawled out like an overgrown dog. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" he said, his voice tinged with admiration. "Guess that makes two of us." The day unfolded in a series of quiet moments. Elliot busied himself with small tasks, adding logs to the fire, sweeping the floor, preparing his own meager breakfast of oatmeal and instant coffee. All the while he kept an eye on the bear, who remained mostly still, conserving its energy for healing. By midday, the sun had broken through the clouds, casting pale beams of light across the snow. Elliot ventured outside to check on his generator, the cold biting at his cheeks as he trudged through the drifts. The world felt eerily empty. The usual sounds of the forest, birdsong, the rustle of branches, were noticeably absent. When he returned to the cabin, the bear was awake, its head lifted as it stared at the door. Elliot paused, following its gaze. Something about the bear's posture seemed deliberate, intentional. "What is it?" he asked, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. The bear turned its head toward him briefly, then back to the door, its nose twitching as though catching a scent. Elliot frowned, his pulse quickening. "You trying to tell me something?" The bear huffed softly, a sound that was neither aggressive nor dismissive. Elliot's heart thudded in his chest as he moved closer, his mind racing with possibilities. Whatever had brought the bear to his cabin, he was beginning to suspect, was far from over. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. Inside the cabin, Elliot paced near the window, glancing at the bear. Its steady gaze remained fixed on the door, an unspoken urgency radiating from its massive frame. "What's out there?" Elliot murmured, though he didn't expect an answer. He rubbed his temples, his breath fogging in the cool air of the cabin. He had spent the better part of the afternoon trying to decipher the bear's behavior, but no matter how he analyzed it, he kept circling back to one undeniable truth. The bear was waiting for something, or someone. The bear shifted its massive paw, scraping against the floor as it tried to rise. Elliot instinctively moved closer, hands half raised as though he could steady the creature. But the bear ignored him, its focus unwavering. It took one unsteady step toward the door and paused, looking back at Elliot with an expression that could only be described as pleading. "You want me to follow you, don't you?" Elliot said softly, his voice wavering with a mix of curiosity and hesitation. The bear let out a low rumble, not threatening but insistent. It nudged its nose toward the door, then glanced back at Elliot again. The message was clear. Outside, the air was sharp and biting, the kind of cold that gnawed at exposed skin. Within seconds, Elliot pulled his heavy parka tight around him, the hood lined with faux fur brushing against his cheeks. His boots crunched over the thick layer of snow as he followed the bear, its lumbering gait surprisingly steady, despite its earlier weakness. The landscape stretched out in every direction, an expanse of white broken only by the dark silhouettes of spruce and pine. The forest seemed alive in its stillness, the occasional groan of trees bending under the weight of snow punctuating the silence. Above them, The sky was a pale canvas streaked with hues of lavender and rose, the remnants of daylight fading fast. Elliot kept a cautious distance, his eyes darting between the bear's injured paw and the path ahead. Tracks in the snow told the story of their journey. A single set of deep paw prints now joined by the smaller, hesitant prints of his own boots. The bear paused suddenly, its ears twitching. Elliot stopped too, his breath hitching. He strained to hear, but all he caught was the faint whistle of the wind through the trees. The bear tilted its head, listening to something Elliot couldn't discern, then resumed its slow, deliberate march. "Where are you taking me?" Elliot muttered, though his words were lost in the icy air. They came to a narrow ridge, the trees thinning to reveal a steep drop into a shallow ravine. Snow had piled against the edges, creating precarious overhangs that threatened to collapse under the slightest weight. The bear stopped at the ridge's edge, lowering its head to sniff the ground. Elliot approached cautiously, his heart pounding. "Easy now," he said, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. "I'm right here." The bear turned its head to look at him, amber eyes glinting in the fading light. Then it let out a sound, half growl, half moan, and stepped forward onto the slope, its injured paw sinking deep into the snow. Elliot hesitated. The slope was treacherous, the kind of terrain that could break bones if one misstep sent him tumbling. But the bear didn't seem to care. It forged ahead, its massive frame moving with a mix of determination and urgency. As Elliot followed, his boots slipped against the icy surface, forcing him to grab at low-hanging branches for support. The descent was slow and painstaking, each step a test of balance and will. The cold air stung his lungs, and his fingers, encased in thick gloves, ached with the effort of gripping the rough bark. Finally, they reached the bottom of the ravine. The bear stopped, its head lifting to sniff the air again. It let out a low rumble and began walking toward a dark shape partially obscured by snow, a jagged outcrop of rock that jutted from the earth like the spine of some ancient beast. Elliot's eyes narrowed. The outcrop was more than just a geological anomaly. It was a cave, its entrance partially hidden by snowdrifts and fallen branches. "You brought me here for this?" Elliot asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The bear didn't respond, of course, but its actions spoke louder than words. It limped toward the cave, pausing at the entrance to glance back at him. The expression in its eyes was unmistakable now, pleading, desperate, almost human in its intensity. Elliot hesitated at the threshold, the cave's mouth yawning open before him, dark and uninviting. He fumbled with his flashlight, the beam slicing. Through the gloom as he stepped inside, the air was colder here, the silence oppressive. His breath echoed faintly against the stone walls. The bear followed him inside, its presence a comforting weight in the dark. It nudged past him, its movements purposeful despite its injury. Elliot watched as it approached a shadowed corner, where a small, shivering shape lay huddled against the rock. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust, but when they did, his breath caught in his throat. Two cubs, barely more than bundles of fur, were pressed against the cold stone. Their tiny bodies trembled with each shallow breath, their eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. "Oh my God," Elliot whispered. He dropped to his knees, the flashlight trembling in his hand. "You have cubs." The mother bear turned to him, her massive head lowering as if to acknowledge his words. Then she nudged one of the cubs gently, her nose brushing against its fragile body. Elliot swallowed hard, his throat tight. He had spent years capturing moments like this through the lens of his camera, scenes of raw, untamed beauty that told stories without words. But this moment wasn't meant for a photograph. It was meant for action. He reached out cautiously, his gloved hand brushing against the fur of the nearest cub. It was cold, far too cold. "They won't survive out here," he said, his voice barely audible. "Not like this." The mother bear rumbled softly, the sound vibrating through the stone. It wasn't a growl, but something deeper, a sound that seemed to resonate with trust. Elliot made his decision. He carefully lifted one of the cubs, cradling its fragile body against his chest. The other cub followed, its tiny paws clawing weakly at his coat as he scooped it up. "We're going back to the cabin," he said, glancing at the mother bear. "All of us." As he stepped back into the fading light of the ravine, the cubs clutched protectively in his arms. The mother bear followed close behind. For the first time in years, Elliot felt something stir within him, a purpose he had thought lost in the depths of his own grief. The journey back to the cabin was slow and arduous, the snow deepening as the sun sank below the horizon. Elliot held the two cubs close to his chest, their fragile bodies trembling against the thick fabric of his parka. Each step he took carried them closer to warmth, to shelter, and to something he hadn't known he was searching for. Each step felt heavier than the last, his boots sinking deep into the icy drifts that blanketed the forest floor. Behind him, the mother bear followed, her lumbering form a silent shadow in the twilight. The wind had picked up again, sharp and unrelenting, seeping through even the warmest layers. Elliot adjusted his grip on the cubs, his arms aching, but, "Steady? Hang on, little ones," he murmured, his breath misting in the frosty air. "We're almost there." The cabin appeared through the trees like a beacon, its soft golden light spilling into the encroaching darkness. Relief surged through Elliot as they drew closer, his heart pounding with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. He reached the porch and carefully opened the door, the warmth inside wrapping around him like an embrace. The mother bear hesitated at the threshold, her massive silhouette framed by the dark. Elliot turned, voice low and soothing. "Come on. It's safe here." She stepped inside cautiously, her claws clicking softly against the wooden floor. Her breath came in slow, visible puffs as she sniffed the air, her gaze darting across the small space. Elliot shut the door behind her, sealing out the cold and the storm beginning to gather once more. He laid the cubs on a folded blanket near the wood stove, their tiny bodies curling instinctively toward the warmth. Kneeling beside them, his hands moved with practiced care as he checked for injuries. One of the cubs whimpered, a soft, plaintive sound that tugged at his chest. "They're so cold," he muttered, glancing toward the fire. He added another log, the flames crackling, brightening. The mother bear settled a short distance away, her weary eyes locked on her cubs. There was something in that gaze, an unspoken mix of trust and hope, that made his throat tighten. He reached for an old quilt and gently tucked it around the cubs. Their shivering eased, their breathing evening out as warmth enveloped them. "There you go," he whispered. "You're safe now." The mother bear let out a low rumble, her head lowering to the floor. Elliot glanced at her, his heart aching at the sight of her exhaustion. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" His voice barely rose above the fire's crackle. The hours passed in quiet rhythm, the cabin filled with the soft sounds of the fire and the occasional rustle of fur. Elliot moved between tending the cubs and preparing a simple meal, canned soup and crackers. He found himself glancing at the bear again and again, marveling at this unlikely companionship. When the cubs finally stirred, their tiny noses twitching at the scent of food, he felt a surge of relief. He opened another can of salmon, placing it on a shallow dish. The mother bear nudged it toward her cubs, watching as they ate with slow, tentative bites. Elliot leaned against the counter, a faint smile tugging at his lips. For the first time in what felt like forever, the cabin didn't feel empty. The bears, quiet and resilient, filled the space with a kind of life he hadn't realized he'd missed. As night fell, he sat by the fire, his thoughts drifting like embers in the rising smoke. The day's events felt surreal, like a story he might have told himself on one of those lonely nights when the silence became too heavy. He glanced toward the mother bear, curled protectively around her cubs, her breathing slow and steady. Her eyes were closed in what seemed like the first true rest she'd had in days. "You remind me of someone," Elliot said quietly, voice nearly lost in the fire's murmur. His mind wandered to memories long buried, his wife Claire and their daughter Sophie. Claire had been unshakably strong, always protecting those she loved. Sophie's laughter had once filled their home, echoing in every room. The cabin had never known that kind of joy, and for years he'd convinced himself it never would. But now, watching the cubs snuggle close to their mother, something flickered within him. Something like hope. Outside, the storm settled into a whisper. Inside, the fire cast a golden glow across the walls. Elliot sat with his camera in his lap, untouched. He hadn't taken a single photograph of the bears. It didn't feel right to capture their vulnerability like that. Instead, he simply watched. The mother bear's breathing softened. Her cubs nestled close. Firelight danced across their fur, painting the scene in amber and gold. It was a picture he'd carry in his memory forever, a reminder of the beauty that could rise from the harshest winter. As sleep claimed him, Elliot whispered into the quiet, words meant only for himself. You saved them, and maybe, they're saving me too. The cabin settled into stillness. The warmth of the fire warded off the cold, and for the first time in years, Elliot closed his eyes with a sense of peace, knowing they were safe, for now. Morning light filtered through frosted panes, casting pale streaks across the wooden floor. The cabin, usually silent at this hour, hummed softly with life. The cubs stirred beneath the quilt, tiny paws twitching as they shifted closer to one. Another. The mother bear remained curled nearby, her breath rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Elliot sat at the kitchen table, nursing a mug of coffee. The steam curled upward into the light and vanished. His hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the weight of what came next. He glanced toward the bears. Their presence filled the room with an energy he hadn't felt in years. The mother bear's fur had begun to dry, the crusts of ice falling away. The cubs, though still frail, seemed stronger. Yet reality lingered. This sanctuary was temporary. He rose from the table and added another log to the fire. The flames responded eagerly. He crouched beside the stove, staring into the heart of the blaze. I can't keep you here, he said softly, more to himself than to them. You need to go. Back to where you belong. The thought of sending them back into the wild unsettled him. He had seen nature's cruelty, its cycles of survival and loss. Could they endure more? The mother bear stirred. Her ears twitched. She lifted her head, amber eyes meeting his. There was something in her gaze that steadied him, an unshakable resolve. She had faced the wild before. She would again. The day passed in preparation. Elliot gathered supplies, dried fish, jerky, and turned an old tarp into a makeshift sled. The mother bear watched, her head tilted slightly, as if understanding. The cubs explored the cabin's edges, tottering on unsteady legs. One pawed, at a loose thread on the quilt. The other followed, growling softly in playful determination. Troublemakers, Elliot said, chuckling, the sound startling in the quiet. He crouched down and extended his hand. The smaller cub stepped forward, nose twitching, and nudged him gently. You've got some fight in you, don't you? He murmured. Good. You're going to need it. By mid-afternoon, the sled was ready. Blankets lined the base, a soft bed for the journey. He tied the tarp securely, checking every knot. The mother bear moved closer, her injured paw dragging slightly. Elliot knelt beside her, resting his hands on his knees. It's going to be a long walk, he said, meeting her gaze. But I'll get you there, I promise. She rumbled low in her chest, eyes steady and calm. Elliot felt something stir in response. A conviction born not from duty, but from something deeper. Compassion and hope. Admiration filled Elliot as he looked at her. The kind of strength that came not from power, but from enduring, from surviving. What most wouldn't. Their first steps into the wilderness were careful and slow. Elliot pulled the sled behind him. The cubs nestled under dark blankets, their small faces peeking out, alert and quiet. The mother bear walked beside him, her stride uneven but full of purpose. The snow, though still deep, had crusted slightly, under the faint warmth of the sun, making the journey more manageable. The forest felt different now, less hostile, more like an old friend keeping its distance. The trees stood in quiet attention, their limbs bowed under snow's weight. The Air smelled of pine and earth, clean and cold. For the first time in longer than he could recall, Elliot moved with a sense of direction that came from within. They traveled in near silence, the only sound the crunch of boots and paws and the occasional sigh of wind through the trees. His thoughts drifted, pulled into memory. Claire, Sophie, the laughter that used to ring through their home, the crash, the silence that followed. But beside these bears, something had begun to thaw in him. Not a revelation, not some cinematic epiphany, just a quiet shift like ice loosening its grip on a stream bed. Life could still reach through grief, could still offer connection, even if only for a moment. As the light faded, they came upon a clearing near a frozen stream. Elliot stopped, breath clouding in the air. The place felt right, trees forming a natural ring that blocked the worst of the wind. "This might do," he said, glancing at the mother bear. She sniffed the air, ears twitching, eyes scanning. Then, with what looked like approval, she nudged the sled gently. He untied the sled and lifted the cubs out one by one. They stretched and sniffed, their little paws pressing delicate prints into the snow. The mother curled around them protectively, drawing them close with a deep exhale. Elliot stepped back, his chest tightened. This was what they needed, a place to recover, to grow, to return to the wild. But the idea of leaving them behind scraped at him. "You'll be okay," he said, voice catching. "Stronger than I ever was." The mother bear lifted her head and met his gaze. Something passed. Between them, recognition, gratitude, maybe goodbye. He nodded and turned away. The walk back was long and quiet. The sled behind him empty, its weight a strange comfort. Snow crunched beneath his boots, the trail behind him filling with dusk. A peace settled in his bones, soft, unexpected. He had done what he could. That would have to be enough. The cabin greeted him with warmth and flickering firelight. He stepped inside, let the door close behind him. Sitting by the stove, camera in hand, he stared into the flames. For the first time in years, he didn't feel quite so alone. The days that followed carried a hush he couldn't explain. The cabin felt different, emptier, sure, but also imbued with something else. A memory. He rose before dawn each morning, made coffee and sat at the table by the frosted window. Outside, the snow covered everything. The tracks, the broad prints of the mother, the feather-light marks of her cubs, had vanished under fresh snowfall. He found himself wondering, were they safe? Were the cubs finding strength? Was she still carrying that unshakable resilience? Often his gaze lingered on the edge of the trees, half expecting movement, though he knew they wouldn't return. He set his mug down with a soft clink. The sound echoed louder than it should have in the still cabin. He still felt a chill deep, inside, not from the cold, but from absence. The memory of their presence clung to the corners of the space like a dream refusing to fade. That afternoon, Elliot ventured out, camera slung over his shoulder. The storm had passed, leaving the forest glittering under pale sun. Snow blanketed the earth like glass dust. His steps were slow, deliberate, the air biting at his face. He hadn't touched the camera since the bears arrived. Holding it again felt strange. Photography had once been his refuge, the lens a barrier, something to hide behind. It let him observe, not feel. But now the camera felt heavier, its distance unwelcome. He stopped at the clearing where he'd left them. The stream was still frozen, the trees silent. He stood there for a long time, camera dangling at his side. The place felt hollow, beautiful but missing something vital. He raised the viewfinder, framing the stream, the trees, the light. But just before he pressed the shutter, his hand dropped. The image felt empty. What he wanted to capture wasn't here. It had moved on with them. A long breath escaped him. He closed his eyes. It wasn't the photograph he needed. It was the memory, the bond. The bears weren't subjects anymore. They were part of the story. Part of his story. A sound stopped him. Soft, subtle. The crunch of snow. He turned sharply, scanning the forest. A flicker of movement, shadow against bark. Gone before he could name it. "Hello?" he called. His voice dissolved into the still air. No reply, only wind and whispering trees. But the sound had been real. His walk back was slower. Something in the woods had shifted, as if the forest was watching, waiting. The fire welcomed him home. He set the camera on the table and slumped into his chair. The warmth wrapped around him, but his mind wouldn't quiet. The sound haunted him, teased at something just beyond reach. That night he dreamed, the bears again. The mother standing at the edge of the clearing, her cubs huddled at her side. She turned, eyes locking with his. There was meaning in them, urgent and sorrowful. He reached out, but the dream dissolved before he could understand. He woke with a jolt, heart racing. The fire had burned low. He sat up, rubbing his face. The dream felt too vivid to dismiss. The mother's gaze followed him, even in waking. He fed the fire, the flames growing again. The dream felt like a call, a message. Their connection hadn't ended. Not truly. As dawn colored the sky in pink and gold, Elliot stood at the window. Snow stretched endlessly, the trees still and silent. He didn't reach for the camera. He just stood there, letting the quiet fill him. He made a promise to them, to himself. He would honor their story, not through images, through action. He would care for this place, protect it, nurture it. Maybe in doing that, he'd find his way back to the life he once knew. Their paw prints would fade, but the memory of what they shared would remain, a gentle echo of connection born in the heart of winter. Weeks passed. The grip of snow loosened, giving way to patches of earth and curled brown leaves. The cold persisted, but so did the promise of spring. The change was subtle but constant. Elliot's days remained quiet. He chopped wood, tended the stove, made simple meals. But something inside had shifted. The cabin, once his fortress, now felt like the center of something larger. Not a retreat, but a beginning. One crisp morning he stepped outside. Something new stirring in his chest. Elliot was preparing to head into the woods with his camera when something in the distance caught his eye. Through the window, a dark shape emerged from the trees, a familiar lumbering figure that made his breath catch. It was the mother bear. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her head high, surveying the cabin. Her fur, once matted and dull, now shimmered in the light, and though her injured paws still moved with some stiffness, it bore her weight confidently. Behind her, two smaller shapes appeared, her cubs darting in and out of the shadows, their playful energy unmistakable. Elliot's heart swelled as he stepped outside, his boots pressing softly into the snow. He stopped a respectful distance, away, not wanting to intrude. The mother bear watched him, her amber eyes steady and calm. For a moment they simply stood there, two beings bound by a shared history. Elliot raised a hand in a quiet wave, a silent gesture of recognition. The mother bear let out a low, rumbling huff, her gaze lingering on him a moment longer before she turned back to the forest. The cubs followed her, their tiny prints crisscrossing the snow as they bounded after her. Elliot watched them until the trees swallowed their forms, his chest tight with a mix of joy and melancholy. He knew they belonged there in the wild, but seeing them healthy and thriving filled him with a quiet pride. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elliot sat by the wood stove with his notebook. Its pages were filled with years of sketches and notes, but tonight he started something new. The first line came slowly, chosen with care. This winter, a mother bear and her cubs found their way to my door, and in helping them, I found my way back to myself. Words followed like a stream, pouring from memory and emotion. He wrote of the storm, of the fragile trust that had grown between them, of their quiet journey to the frozen stream. He wrote of the gentle moments, the cubs tucked under quilts, the soft breathing of the mother bear beside the fire, the way her eyes seemed to carry unspoken truths. For the first time in years, Elliot felt a purpose beyond survival. The story was no longer just about the bears. It was about resilience, about connection, about how life finds ways to heal even the deepest wounds. Spring arrived in bursts of color, the valley coming alive with birdsong and the gentle hum of bees. The forest, once shrouded in snow, now bloomed with wildflowers and vibrant greenery. Elliot spent more time outside, his camera in hand, capturing the transformation. One afternoon, while walking beside the stream, he returned to the clearing, where he had left the bears. The snow had melted, revealing tender grass and moss-covered patches. He stood there for a long while, imagining the bears wandering freely through the woods. His heart felt full. He set his camera down and closed his eyes, letting the sounds of the forest envelop him. The rustling leaves, a bird's distant call, the stream murmuring softly. They all seemed to echo the same truth. Life goes on. The cabin, once a retreat from pain, had become a sanctuary, not only for the bears but for Elliot himself. He still carried his past, but it no longer weighed him down. The memories of Claire and Sophie, once sharp reminders of loss, had softened, becoming threads woven into the fabric of his story, part of a life that was still unfolding. One evening he sat on the porch, the sky brushed with gold and lavender. His journal rested on his lap, its pages now rich with sketches and reflections from a winter he would never forget. He turned to a new page and began to write. We are all connected in ways we may never fully understand. In helping a mother bear and her cubs, I found something I thought I had lost, a reason to hope, a reason to heal. As the sun sank behind the trees, Elliot closed the journal and looked out over the forest. A faint smile touched his lips. For the first time in years he felt ready to face whatever lay ahead, not as a man marked by sorrow, but as someone who had rediscovered the quiet strength of connection and the resilience born from compassion. And as the first stars blinked into the night sky, he whispered into the stillness, a promise carried on the wind. Thank you. Through a harsh winter and the unspoken bond between man and beast, a story unfolded, one of resilience, trust, and quiet transformation. Elliot thought he was saving the bears, but perhaps they had saved him. If this story touched your heart, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves a meaningful tale, and most importantly, subscribe to join me for more stories that inspire and move us. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.